Cybersecurity is all about crisis management. Either you're planning for one or you're dealing with one. Today's guest is Jonathan Hemus. Today, he'll share with you the extensive experience that he has in dealing with crises. His goal is not just to make the organization survive a crisis, but to become stronger thanks to it. Let's listen to his narratives.
Hi folks, welcome to a thrilling new episode of Cyber Narratives. My name is Mathieu, Cyber Dr. Puto, and today here we have Jonathan Hemus, who joined us as an expert in crisis management. He's wrote a wonderful book called Crisis Proof: How to Prepare for the Worst Day of Your Business Life. Great. Jonathan, welcome to Cyber Narratives.
Thanks, Mathieu. It's great to be here.
Wonderful. Great. So before we get started a bit, the whole topic of this podcast is going to be about crisis. Just so we're all on the same page, can you tell us a bit more about what a crisis means?
I guess in simple terms, a crisis is any significant incident or issue which threatens long-term harm to your organization. That can be harm to reputation, harm to operations, harm to financial performance, and of course, harm to your stakeholders, not least your employees. So in broad terms, a crisis can be anything from a major accident to an environmental incident through to management misdeeds and, of course, cyber incidents.
Mm-hmm. One key thing that stuck to me here is the fact that it's long-term. Why did you mention that it has to be long-term?
Because we all deal with problems and incidents almost every day of our business lives, and that is just part of being in business or working in a major organization. What distinguishes a crisis is it's not the kind of thing which will definitively be done and dusted and finished and resolved within hours, days at the most. It is the kind of event which can do that long-term, enduring harm to an organization. It doesn't have to, but it has a significant level of threat associated to it, not just in the very short term, but over a longer period of time. And if we look at the very worst examples, let's take one which is in the news again at the moment, which is Boeing. Their air crashes, 2 air crashes affecting the 737 MAX, in which over 300 people were killed. Those crises the actual events around about 5 years ago now. However, the damage to the organization continues. That is the most monumental type of crisis, one that affects the organization for many, many years or even forever. But certainly we're looking for something to be defined as a crisis, something which lasts at least 4 months, if not 4 years. That is, it lasts for months, if not years, if you don't respond to it well.
That's a long time. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense when you think about companies dating way back. Enron is not going to recover. Like, there's so many things that are taking a long time, and you point out some really cool examples. So in your book, so can't wait to hear more about those. Jonathan, maybe on a more personal note, how did you get started in crisis management?
Yeah, so I've been working in crisis management for almost 30 years now. I've been running Insignia. We're a specialist crisis management consultancy for 16 years, but I never intended to be a crisis manager. I don't think I've ever met anyone who did set out to be a crisis manager. I guess in my late teens and when I went to university, what I kind of figured out was 3 things I was really interested in. One was business. I've always been fascinated by business. I'm fascinated by people in general, but also business leaders. And I am also fascinated by communication. I love words, I love reading, I love talking. And a crisis is when all those 3 things come together. A business having a situation which significantly affects people and requires its leader to step forward, and with communication being a critical part of crisis response. So without really knowing it, those were three ingredients which ultimately took me into a career in crisis management. My first career was within corporate communication, reputation management, and I gravitated, rather than the kind of showbiz PR or promotional PR, I gravitated very early on toward corporate reputation, and then to protecting corporate reputation. And from there, I then kind of figured out that communication is super important to crisis management, but it isn't just about communication. You can't communicate your way out of a crisis if you can't actually fix the problem itself and make the right decisions and adopt the right strategy to succeed. So that was really the point at which I left communication consultancy and formed Insignia to look at crisis management holistically.
Mm-hmm. And so you said that crisis management is not just about communication, it's also about solving the problem, right? Can you describe a bit more about this solving the problem piece?
Yeah, so one of the things that I always say is crisis management is about doing the right thing and saying the right thing. And it's about doing those things at the same time. So you can communicate brilliantly. I think back to a major UK bank which had a massive problem with an IT upgrade that went wrong. Actually, their communication in the aftermath of that situation, whereby people didn't have access to their bank accounts for days and even weeks in some situations, their communication was actually superb, but they couldn't fix the problem and get the bank accounts back up and running. So the fact that they communicated brilliantly didn't mean that they came out of that situation unscathed. Indeed, their CEO left shortly afterwards and their reputation was badly tarnished, not because they didn't communicate well, but because they couldn't effectively deal with the problem. You also see the reverse, and this particularly affects operationally or technologically led businesses, where they focus all of their attention on fixing the problem, and they say, we need to focus on what needs to be done, forget communicating, let's just get to grips with the problem itself. That doesn't work either, because whilst they might be making good progress in fixing the problem, all of their stakeholders, their customers, their investors, their employees, the media, social media are saying, what's going on here? There's a complete absence of communication. It looks like this organization is either doing nothing, is hiding, or is in chaos. So it is absolutely about fixing the problem and communicating at the same time, not one without the other, not one before the other, but simultaneously. And that's very hard for organizations to do, particularly if they haven't prepared.
Yeah, for sure. That reminds me of having the right communication and solving the problem. When I think back, for instance, I don't know if you remember, WhatsApp was offline for several times. I think in 1 year they were offline twice.
Yeah.
And it's one of these apps that's super critical for billions of people. I think they have over 2 billion users.
Yeah.
And yes, they're working on it, but as a user, I must wait. Is it going to last 5 minutes? Should I wait or should I move on to Telegram for another? So as we say, you need to have both in order to really protect them. Okay. So we talked a bit about crisis. We've defined it. Now, you mentioned something that's very interesting, the preparation side. Why isn't it that we can just, start doing things when a crisis actually activates?
Yeah, it's a great question. The reality is that if you have not planned, prepared, trained, rehearsed before a crisis, chances are you will deliver a suboptimal response. Sometimes the organization will get away with it and they will manage to scramble their way through. But when we see things go horribly wrong and organizations and their stakeholders suffering, it's often because they haven't done their planning or preparation. And I think organizations will be forgiven for suffering a crisis, for a crisis happening to them, What they won't be forgiven for is a botched response to the crisis. All of the evidence shows that it is what you do in the immediate aftermath of the crisis that determines whether you do emerge from that crisis with your reputation, your business intact, or whether you suffer horrendous damage. And that response in turn is heavily predicted by the extent to which you have planned, trained, and rehearsed ahead of time, because there are things that you can do before the event which will undoubtedly result in a more effective, a more purposeful, and ultimately a more successful response when the crisis happens.
Mm-hmm. One thing that you mentioned here that I think is very cool, it's a recurring theme in your book, the idea that we must respond promptly to crisis. And you mentioned in your book about this concept of golden hour, in which companies should answer as fast as possible to a crisis within the first hour. Perhaps shifting here to the cybersecurity piece of it, let's imagine a cyber incident. Why is it important to have a good golden hour, and what can we expect out of it?
Yeah. So again, getting that early response right is so important. When I first started in this business, people used to talk about the first 24 hours. And when it came to communicating with the media, we were looking at the 5 o'clock news bulletin in the afternoon, the newspaper coming out tomorrow. That clearly has not been the case for a long time now. We are dealing with 24-hour real-time news via a multitude of channels, whether traditional broadcast, newspapers, which obviously certainly physical newspapers are not as influential as they were, but all of the online news and social media. And as we all know, that kind of media and that kind of coverage moves at lightning pace, and organizations need to be geared up to respond to that. What we find happens is if the organization isn't able to communicate quickly, is not that people won't talk about what's going on, but everybody else will talk about what's going on apart from you, the organization that's actually at the heart of the situation. So your customers are going to be asking questions, your critics are going to be posting negative information on social media, your investors are going to want to know what's going on, and of course, your own people are also going to be asking questions. Nobody wants the company that employs them to be in the spotlight for all of the wrong reasons. So if you don't communicate in a timely manner, then everybody else will. They will fill that vacuum with maybe misleading, inaccurate, and critical information, which means that very quickly you, the organization who are desperately wanting to protect your organization, just lose control of that. One thing I would say is, what we're not advocating, what I'm not advocating, is communicating anything of which you are not absolutely certain. So we've seen examples where organizations have communicated things which have turned out not to be true, and that then damages their credibility as the crisis unfolds. But there is always something that you can say. You can explain that there has been a situation. You can explain that you are already investigating it. You can explain, how much you care for those who've been affected by the situation, and you can continue to communicate through the situation. But it's important that you have a significant share of voice in that discussion so you can lead the narrative rather than simply follow the crisis.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, I'd like to imagine a scenario in a cyber attack crisis. So let's say typical thing that we saw over the past years, getting ransomware.
Yeah.
Your systems are unavailable.
Yeah.
You're very much in the early phases of the detection. It's been 45 minutes and you don't really know much. What are some examples of things you could communicate about?
So you can, let me give you a couple of real life examples, which I think show the different ways of approaching it. Business called Travelex, foreign exchange business in the UK, one of the preeminent providers of currency to both businesses and travellers. Christmas a couple of years ago, they were the victim of a ransomware attack. their systems went down, their website was unavailable, the transactional system went down so that you couldn't get money via banks either. Travelex said nothing for the first 48, 72 hours, literally nothing. Unsurprisingly, it didn't make the story go away. It just meant, as I mentioned earlier, all your critics, all of the speculators, all of the commentators talking about it, but with no word from Travelex. Even worse, their own employees started becoming unofficial spokespeople on the BBC and critical unofficial spokespeople. So it's tough. I understand why organisations like Travelex don't communicate, but you lose control. And ultimately, this is an example of an organisation that went into administration, went bankrupt, not long after this crisis, and the incident was called out as one of the most significant factors to going into administration. Contrast that with a business called Norshikidro. They're one of the world's leading aluminium producers who also were the victim of a cyber attack, a ransomware attack. They found out at 4 o'clock in the morning that their office systems didn't work, and also their operational technology systems were compromised. The crisis team met. They made two decisions in that first meeting. One, we are going to communicate prolifically and openly throughout this situation. And two, we are not going to pay the ransom. The reason they chose to communicate prolifically and openly was because that was absolutely in keeping with their values. They position themselves always as a very open, transparent organisation, and so they committed to that in the crisis. Far from going bankrupt, as Travelex did, they grew their share price on the back of that approach. They issued 3 statements on day one, and they communicated every day to investors, to the media, to their own people. What did they say? Well, what they said was what they could tell people, what they knew at that point. They clearly didn't go into confidential information, but the first announcement was, we can confirm that Norshikidro has been the subject of a cyber incident. We have activated our incident response team, are investigating and doing everything we can to reduce the impact on our customers and other stakeholders. We will provide more information once it comes to light. So, and they just pumped out safe, accurate, clear information all of the way through. Again, I'm not advocating that your listeners and viewers should tell everything to everyone right up front. You know, information which may compromise your negotiation with the bad guys, anything which is going to cause panic, but there is information that you can put out there to help your stakeholders to know what they should do to deal with the impact on them, and to show that you as an organization are prepared, are responsible, and are stepping forward and owning this situation rather than hiding away from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, standing up and for what the crisis means and representing the organization. You said something interesting about having leverage. And the thing that concerns me with the example of the company that did quite well is that they said that they were not going to pay for the ransom. You're kind of losing leverage when you say that in a way, no? Because you're giving out information about what you're not going to do to the hackers. How do you find that balance between communicate things and not blocking your possibilities?
So couple of thoughts on that. First one was that was not something that they announced publicly, but it was a decision that they made internally. And the reason why that was important internally was because in a crisis, there are so many decisions that have to be made, and there is so much information swirling around that achieving clarity is incredibly helpful. So by them as an organization saying at the beginning of the situation, no matter what happens, we as a leadership team will not pay the ransom, it meant that question was off the table. Right or wrong almost doesn't matter. It's just that it took that potential major discussion point that would have distracted them from managing the rest of the crisis. It took it away. So it wasn't communicated externally, but it gave them that single-mindedness of thought. Clearly, and this is also part of the planning that we touched on earlier on, I believe that all organizations should know as a leadership team what their policy on paying ransoms is before the event, not waiting for the event to decide what their policy is. The policy may not be written down. That can be unhelpful to have your policy written down, but to understand either at one extreme.
Something.
Say again, Matthew.
I'm asking you, in case I could imagine a scenario where this would leak, right? And this would be bad for the company. Is that what you meant?
Absolutely. I mean, the cyber criminals may themselves get hold of that information and know that you are prepared to pay as well, for example, which could very well make you a more attractive target. So it may need to be verbal only, but knowing beforehand what your stance is at one end of the spectrum, like Norshikidro, under no circumstances will we ever pay, through to, do you know what, in these circumstances we would most likely pay. These would be the triggers, these would be the criteria, this would be the decision-making process. But thinking that through beforehand is all part of the scenario planning that means you can respond more sure-footedly if the situation actually occurs.
Makes sense. Yeah, and avoid useless debates and move forward, deliver time, things like that. Jonathan,
I mean, time is so precious in a crisis. We talked about the golden hour. What you never have, there are three things you never have enough of in a crisis. You never have enough time, you never have enough information, and you never have enough resource. And so the more you can do beforehand just to give yourself a better chance of succeeding in that situation, the better. So, we talked about communication earlier on. Pre-preparing statements to deal with various types of cyber incidents, of course, they'll need to be tweaked and tailored according to the actual situation, but don't start from a clean piece of paper when it happens. We all know that cyber attacks can affect any organization, so why not have some in principle agreed statements already drafted, for example? Every organization should have media trained spokespeople ready. Think through some of those critical decisions. We've talked about, the decision as to whether to pay or not, but, have you thought through which actually are your most critical systems, and under what circumstances would you decide to switch those systems off, and in what order would you want to get them back? And given a choice between the business having to shut down for a bit and maintaining security, what would the criteria be that might sway that decision? So there's all sorts of planning and thinking that you can do beforehand that buys you time and gives you greater clarity and certainty when the situation occurs.
Makes sense. This is why you got to prepare. But oftentimes organizations, when it comes to cyber risk or anything else, they'll, especially when it comes to medium-sized enterprise, let's say 500 people, they'll say, we'll figure it out. We have experts. What would you answer to these type of critics? They'll say, we'll figure it on the way.
So a lot of organizations say that. Some of them, when the crisis occurs, they manage to figure their way through it. Sometimes they don't. They suffer enormous damage. And again, as we've seen in the worst case, they cease to exist. Because the reality is that a crisis of any kind, and a cyber incident is like kind of any crisis but on steroids, because it has all of the factors that all crises have but almost magnified. The fact is that it is an extraordinary situation, and business as usual ways of working are relatively ineffective in a crisis. You need to adopt a more purposeful, structured, well-conceived approach. Otherwise, you will falter. So, yeah, sometimes geniuses can figure their way through crises, but often having a really robust process and a team which have practiced deploying that process, that is a much more certain way of succeeding in a crisis.
Mm-hmm. And you point out to something which I think is very important. We'll talk on that later. Culture, right? How important it is to survival of an organization. I like you point out something here that's really interesting. How is a cyber crisis on steroids compared to another type of crisis an organization may face?
Okay, so I've touched on a couple of the reasons already, but let me answer your question directly. In any crisis, you lack full information. You never have all the facts you want. In the context of a cyber attack, a cyber incident, there is a lot that you don't know. And not only do you not know it, but particularly the leadership team often just doesn't understand what has happened. So again, this feeling of, I just don't know what is going on here, is present in most crises, but in a cyber incident, it's magnified. It's even bigger than your traditional crisis. That conflict between wanting to communicate early, but fear of doing so, that is also magnified in a crisis, because many cyber incidents will be visible to the outside world. In other words, people are lacking the services or the access that they had. So the outside world is often immediately aware that a likely cyber incident is taking place. So again, that lack of time and that pressure to communicate quickly is often more intense than in a cyber incident than in a more conventional crisis type. So those are a couple of the reasons why a cyber incident magnifies and puts a really sharp focus on all of the factors that exist in any crisis type.
It's interesting what you say, because I think when sometimes CEO hear this about practicing for a cyber incident, let's say, they'll often say, all right, my security guys are really good. They're gonna do really well. I'm sure they're trained. We paid for expensive training. But I believe you are going to argue otherwise. What do you think about who has to be responsible for responding to cyber crisis throughout an organization?
You're right, Mattia. I am going to argue that the leadership team needs to be involved. The role of leaders in any crisis is to set the strategic decision, make the really big decisions, often take responsibility for the communication, and provide support and direction to those in the front line who are dealing with the problem itself. And we talked about the distinction between solving the problem and communicating. This is another area where there are two things that need to be going on at the same time. One is, yes, the security, the tech guys doing their job, which is clearly going to be critical in responding to a crisis, but that is the technical response. There also needs to be a leadership response. And, the guys in that boardroom or within that senior leadership team, they will be the ones who need to make the big decisions that then their security guys, having provided the leaders with the information, they can then enact. So the role of leaders in a crisis is critical, and they do need to rehearse, because what happens when we run rehearsals for leadership teams, they suddenly realize what they didn't know. For example, how vulnerable they actually are, things about what their technical guys would require from the leadership team. They find out that all of the questions that they're asking, many of them can't be answered at this stage. So it gives them visibility of the environment in which they would be working. It identifies flaws in their current setup, and it enables them to act much more as a team between the security professionals and the leadership team when the crisis happens. And certainly those leadership teams that go through exercises, they then continue to run exercises because they can see the value and the importance of them.
Yeah. And you pointed out here and also in your book, the fact that it's not just useful to prepare for crisis moments, but also in just regular business day-to-life things. I remember once I was having a conversation with a CEO of a company, about 300 employees, and it was decentralized, very much decentralized within agencies. And the CEO was convinced that all of the agencies that he was leading were just done using paper processes. They were all in computers, and therefore they were more vulnerable than they thought. And when we did the analysis and talked to the lower level guys, we realized, don't worry, like in most of the organizations, they have a paper process. We will only lose about 20% of our throughput. It's not that bad. So I think, preparing for what could come is absolutely a super important lessons for leaders and people below the organization to communicate information that are critical to the functioning of business.
Definitely. Yeah. I would wholeheartedly endorse that.
And one thing that you talked about that surprised me, which was, you point out an example of a story of a travel agency, a travel organizer called Thomas Cook, that was responsible for the death of 2 kids. And you point out that the fact that they didn't do what you point out is the right thing in the commission. Can you walk us through this example and tell us what the right thing might have been within this circumstances?
Yeah, so this was a situation where, as you described, Thomas Cook were a very, very well-established UK travel agent. They've been in business since the late 1900s. Late 1800s. They built their business on providing family trips from the cities to the seaside. Expanded massively over the century after that. As you described, 2 young children died in a villa in Corfu from carbon monoxide poisoning, and it was a Thomas Cook tour that the family had been on. To cut a long story short and to simplify it, what Thomas Cook fundamentally said was, this is not our problem. This is the hotel's problem. It was the hotel that was at fault for not having the right carbon monoxide monitoring system in place in the villa. It was their responsibility. It's not our crisis. And as a consequence of them determining that it was not their responsibility and not their crisis, what they also failed to do was to say how sorry they were to the parents of the children that died. Now, one can argue that legally, maybe they might have thought they were right. Ultimately, a court found differently, but you might be able to argue that there was a legal case for that. Whether or not there is a legal case for doing that, there is a right thing to do. And the right thing to do when a family has gone on holiday, your organization has taken them on holiday, and 2 children have not returned home with their parent, the right thing to do is to show care, compassion, and to say how dreadfully sorry you are for what has happened. And Thomas Cook fought against saying sorry for years and years and years, and their name was dragged through the mud throughout that period. And Thomas Cook are once again an example of an organization that the airline still exists, but the tour operating company no longer exists, partly because of their response to this crisis. And what crisis management requires is a leader, a CEO often, who is prepared to do and say the right things. They listen to advice, they listen to the lawyers, they listen to the accountants, they listen to the PR advisors, but they then, take a quiet moment to decide what is the right thing to do, both in terms of, our own values and simply as a human being. What is the right thing to do? What is the right decision?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's something that you say, that the way you explained it, you said Thomas Cook is a family tour organizer. And
Yeah.
then when you think about, something harm happening to kids,
Yeah,
it's completely opposite to values that you have about
yeah,
your company. So
totally.
how
And
are values? Yeah, go ahead.
values, you've taken the words out of my mouth. Crises, your response to a crisis must absolutely be values led. And in your crisis response, you need to epitomize your values in everything that you do and say. So, what you have led the world to believe your organization is all about needs to be exemplified in your crisis response. And there's evidence that shows that organizations which respond to a crisis in a way which is counter to their values or how they professed the organization to be all about, that they suffer more damage to their reputation and to their finances than those that never claimed those values in the first place. So to take a similar take a simple example. If you imagine two airlines, a low cost airline, no frills, cheap, service standards aren't very good, but they get you there for the lowest price, usually. And then you think about, one of the most prestigious airline brands in the world, maybe one that's built on phenomenal customer service. If you imagine those two airlines having a major crisis whereby passengers are directly affected, maybe it is an aircraft, both organizations would suffer, but if they both acted in a way which was less than caring for their customers and their passengers, the low-cost airline would suffer less in terms of its business and reputation than the one that has built its reputation on customer care. So know what you stand for as an organization and epitomize that in your crisis response, or suffer the harm that comes from not doing that.
Mhm. Makes sense. And there must be in your work, Jonathan, there must be a bit of risk assessment, if I may, or reputational risk assessment. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole process of crisis management begins with risk assessment. And of course, it begins with conventional risk assessment. So if you run a factory, if you run an oil and gas company, there will be, health and safety risks which need to be factored into your crisis management planning. Likewise, there will be financial and operational risks that need to be teased out. Historically, reputational risk has not been covered as effectively within risk assessment. But what we are seeing these days is that there are more and more reputationally focused crises, and they're often the most challenging to deal with because they're about us as an organization, they're about our behaviors, our actions, our values, and actually responding to a reputationally focused crisis can be a lot more painful and personal than responding to an accident or an incident. But yeah, absolutely doing a reputational risk assessment. And for example, increasingly we are running exercises based on management misdeed. A rogue senior management team member who's either doing something criminal or inappropriate. That's not because the client in question believes that's actually going on. It's because they recognize that people are people in every organization and it could happen. And if we're blind to those kind of crises because it's uncomfortable to think that someone might possibly do something unethical or illegal, then if and when it happens again, we're going to be paralyzed because we haven't conceived of that happening. So yeah, reputational risk, assessing it, and then planning against that risk is super important, particularly these days.
Makes sense. Good. Jonathan, I want to run a risk scenario by you. Is it okay if I put you in the spotlight a bit?
Of course.
Great, let's do it. So, Jonathan, let's say you're a newly appointed CEO of a tech company and there's no plans, nothing. You don't know a lot of the team yet. And a ransomware crisis hits you. what do you do?
Okay, so first thing we do is we form a team. Depends how new I am, but I'd want to get 4 or 5 people around me that I trust. I would want the right people, and by the right people, I mean not just the right job title, but those that also have the right personalities and individual strengths to support me. So I'd want that close team of senior colleagues around me. I would also want, clearly, subject matter experts. But what I would be very conscious of doing is not, for example, pulling the whole tech team into my team to answer all of our questions, because that stops them getting on with their jobs. But I certainly want a link into that team so that we're getting latest information and the facts as we understand them. What I would then be doing is with that group of people, I would be determining what we call our strategic intent. So what that means is, what does success look like at the end of this crisis? So I would be determining, what are we actually trying to achieve here? Because if I don't do that, my team or 5 or 6 people might all have different perceptions of what we are trying to do here. One might be thinking, well, what's at stake here is getting our systems back up and running if the ransomware has taken them out as quickly as possible. Another member of my team might be thinking, what we're trying to do here is protect the data, the information about our customers and our employees. Another one might be thinking, what I'm really looking to do here is to prevent a health and safety incident, because maybe this technology that has been brought down could actually cause harm to human life by not being in place. Maybe it powers hospitals, for example. So I think the first thing to do is to define what success looks like. I think we then need to be determining what are the most important things that we need to do now. And they are probably, understanding more about what has happened, but also critically, and we talked about it earlier on, I would then be developing very quickly our communication plan and getting ready to communicate with our key stakeholders. And depending again on the nature of the situation, what I also find very helpful in a crisis is being very clear about who our priority stakeholders are, because in any situation there might be 10 or 15 different stakeholder groups, investors, customers, employees, the media. And so a very good question early on that I would be asking is, who is most directly impacted by this attack? They should be priorities for communication. And secondly, who is going to have most influence over our success in navigating through this crisis? And there could be law enforcement, it could be government, it could be regulators, it could be customers, it could be employees. So because we can't do everything, I would be looking to prioritize. So, and I would hope, if we haven't already done so, we're going to make that in principle decision about under what circumstances will we pay. So get the right people together, get a direct line through to those who can provide us with information, set strategic intent, and prioritize what we're going to do first and who we're going to communicate with first.
Wow, that was a really complete answer. Wow. It seems like you've been there before.
Yeah, I may have been in 1 or 2 rooms where that's been happening for real.
Yeah, it must be a challenge. It must be a bit of a nervous job sometimes, not to deal with crisis.
I think it's like many things, many jobs, many roles, many experiences. Because this is what we do for a living, we never take it for granted, or we never underplay the seriousness or importance of what's going on.
Wonderful. Great answer. Jonathan, if people want to hear more about what you do, about your company, where can they find more information about that?
So they can find me on LinkedIn via Jonathan Hemus. I'm fortunate enough to have a relatively unique name, so you'll find me on LinkedIn, or alternatively, go to insigniacrisis.com to find out more about my team and my organisation. Loads of good resources on there, by the way. Other webinars apart from Mathieu's that you may want to tune into. But yeah, those are the two main sources.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thanks, Mathieu.